On the morning of November 24th, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Eggert stared into the glowing green eye of his radar scope aboard the USS Lexington and witnessed something that would redefine aerial warfare forever. The circular screen pulsed with dozens of Blips enemy aircraft approaching from the northwest, their formations tight and disciplined as they streaked toward the American Carrier Task Force, positioned off the Philippine coast. What the Japanese pilots didn't know was that they were about to encounter not just superior aircraft, but a revolution in combat coordination that would turn the sky into a mathematically orchestrated killing field. The Pacific War had reached a critical juncture by late 1944. Japan's once formidable carrier air groups had been decimated at the Philippine Sea in June, an engagement American aviators grimly nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive work History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese had lost over 600 aircraft in that single engagement, along with irreplaceable veteran pilots whose training had taken years to complete. Now, as American forces closed in on the Philippines themselves, Japan's air defenses relied increasingly on hastily trained replacement pilots, many with fewer than 100 hours of flight time. Commander Eggert adjusted the gain on his SK-to-air search radar, a technological marvel that could detect aircraft formations at distances exceeding 100 miles. The equipment hummed and crackled in the darkened Combat Information Center, a space barely larger than a suburban bedroom, yet functioning as the nerve center for coordinating the fleet's aerial defense. Around him, plotters moved colored markers across transparent boards, tracking friendly and hostile forces with practiced precision. But Eggert's attention remained fixed on the scope, where the enemy formation leader identified as elements of the Japanese Second Air Fleet maintained their course directly toward the task force. The revolution Eggert represented had begun years earlier, when scientists at the Naval Research Laboratory and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology developed practical airborne and shipboard radar systems. These electronic eyes could pierce clouds, darkness, and the vast distances of the Pacific, giving American forces an advantage that Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend. But radar alone wasn't enough. The true innovation lay in the doctrine of fighter direction, using radar operators like Eggert to guide intercepting fighters to their targets with unprecedented precision. Eggert keyed his radio transmitter, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "All Hellcat flights, this is base. Bandits bearing 310, distance 70 miles, Angels 18. Vector 320 for intercept." His words reached 50 Grumman F6F Hellcat fighters orbiting in defensive patterns around the task force, each pilot instantly responding to his directions. The Hellcat had proven itself the most effective carrier fighter of the war, combining speed, firepower, and ruggedness in a package that Japanese aircraft could rarely match. But on this morning, these 50 aircraft would fight not as individual hunters, but as a single coordinated weapon system with Eggert as its guiding intelligence. The radar scope before Lieutenant Commander Eggert displayed a chess game, played at 300 miles per hour, where every decision carried life or death consequences. He calculated intercept angles with practiced ease, his mind performing trigonometry that would have required pencil and paper for most people. The Japanese formation went as 7 bombers escorted by 19 fighters, according to his count, maintained their heading, apparently unaware that American radar had detected them before they cleared their own coastline. This situational blindness represented Japan's critical disadvantage in the war's later stages. Fighter direction as a tactical doctrine had evolved through hard lessons learned in the war's early years. According to the Big E, the story of the USS Enterprise by Commander Edward P. Stafford, early carrier battles like Coral Sea and Midway had been chaotic affairs where fighters often missed enemy formations entirely, wandering through empty sky while bombers attacked their ships unopposed. The U.S. Navy had recognized that technological superiority meant nothing without the doctrine and training to exploit it effectively. Eggert's team had trained together for 8 months before this deployment, practicing interception problems until the coordination between radar operator and fighter pilot became instinctive. The Combat Information Center operated on principles borrowed from industrial management, scientific efficiency applied to warfare. Each specialist performed a specific function. Radar operators tracked targets. Plotting teams maintained the tactical picture. And fighter direction officers like Eggert synthesized everything into actionable commands. This division of cognitive labor allowed for faster, more accurate decisions than any single person could achieve alone. Hellcat leader, bandits now bearing 315, distance 50 miles, Eggert transmitted. adjusting his intercept vector slightly as the Japanese formation made a minor course correction. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, already an ace with 19 confirmed kills, led the intercepting fighters. McCampbell's voice crackled back through the radio. Roger, base. I have visual on friendlies forming up. Climbing to Angels 20, the Hellcats Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines howled as they clawed for altitude. Each aircraft carrying 650 caliber machine guns loaded with over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. The Japanese pilots, most of them recent graduates of compressed training programs, flew their obsolescent aircraft with determination if not skill. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, once the terror of the Pacific, had been rendered nearly obsolete by American aircraft that combined superior speed and firepower with armor protection. The Japanese doctrine of extreme lightness sacrificing protection for maneuverability had worked brilliantly in 1941 and early 1942, when their pilots were the world's most experienced naval aviators. But by late 1944, that experience had been expended, and the doctrine's weaknesses were brutally apparent. Eggert watched the blips converge on his scope, knowing that the mathematical abstractions represented young men hurtling toward violent collision. The radar couldn't show him the human dimension. The Japanese pilots scanning empty sky, searching desperately for the enemy they knew must be near. The American fighter pilots checking their gun sights and oxygen systems, their hearts pounding as combat approached. But Eggert's job required emotional distance, the ability to see aircraft as game pieces on a board rather than as vessels containing human beings. Bandits at 40 miles, steady on course, he transmitted, his voice maintaining its professional monotone. Hellcat leader, you should have radar contact. The Hellcats carried their own primitive radar sets, small units capable of detecting targets at ranges of 5 miles or less, a tactical advantage that complemented Eggert's strategic coordination. At 35,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Commander McCampbell squinted through his gun sight and caught his first glimpse of the Japanese formation, dark specks against the brilliant tropical sky, still tiny with distance, but growing steadily larger. The sun sat behind the American fighters, giving them the advantage of approaching from the enemy's blind spot. McCampbell rocked his wings, signaling the other Hellcat leaders to deploy their flights according to the attack plan they'd rehearsed countless times. What happened next would demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of coordinated aerial warfare. The Japanese formation flew in a standard defensive arrangement, with the 19-0 fighters positioned above and to the sides of the 27 Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers. This escort pattern had worked adequately earlier in the war, but it assumed that attackers would approach from predictable directions, and that the defenders would have time to react. Lieutenant Commander Eggert's fighter direction shattered both assumptions. Using his radar picture, he had positioned different Hellcat divisions to attack simultaneously from multiple directions, creating a tactical situation that overwhelmed the Japanese pilots' ability to respond coherently. All Hellcat flights, commence attack, McCampbell transmitted, then pushed his stick forward and ducked toward the Japanese formation. His wingmen followed, their Hellcats accelerating past 350 miles per hour in the dive. The aircraft's 6 machine guns were harmonized to converge at 1,000 feet point-blank range. In aerial combat, behind McCampbell's division, 3 other Hellcat groups attacked from different quadrants, their movements coordinated by Eggert's continued radio directions from the Lexington. The historical record, preserved in action reports held at the National Archives, documents what happened in the next 12 minutes with clinical precision. The Japanese Zero fighters, seeing threats from multiple directions simultaneously, fragmented their defensive formation as individual pilots turned to meet the closest attackers. This instinctive response, natural for pilots trained in individual air combat maneuvers, was exactly what the American doctrine exploited. By attacking from multiple directions at once, the Hellcats ensured that Japanese pilots had to choose which threat to engage, leaving others free to attack the now vulnerable bombers. McCampbell selected a Judy dive bomber that had broken formation in a desperate attempt to escape. The Grumman fighter closed rapidly, its superior speed making the outcome inevitable. At 800 feet, McCampbell pressed his trigger, and 6 streams of 50 caliber bullets converged on the Japanese aircraft. The rounds, each weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at over 1,000 feet per second, tore through the Judy's thin aluminum skin. The bomber shuddered, trailing smoke, then rolled onto its back and plunged toward the ocean far below. Aboard the Lexington, Eggert maintained his running commentary, his radar scope showing the aerial battle as a swirling mass of blips that separated, merged, and occasionally disappeared as aircraft were destroyed or dove below the radar's minimum detection altitude. Hellcat 5, you have to bandits on your 6 o'clock, range 2 miles, closing. He transmitted urgently. The warned pilot Ensign Richard Stambuk broke hard left, forcing his Zero pursuers to follow through a turn where the Hellcat's superior roll rate gave him a critical advantage. Stambuk's wingmen, following doctrine, reversed course and attacked the Zeros from behind, shooting down one and damaging the other badly enough to drive it from the fight. The systematic destruction continued for another 9 minutes. Japanese pilots, many experiencing their first combat, made predictable mistakes that veteran American fighter pilots exploited ruthlessly. Some froze on the controls when attacked, flying straight and level until bullets found them. Others attempted aggressive maneuvers their training had emphasized, but their aircraft lacked the power and structural strength to execute these tactics against heavier, faster opponents. The aerial battle had fragmented into dozens of individual engagements, scattered across 30 cubic miles of sky. Yet Lieutenant Commander Eggert's radar continued tracking the broader pattern. Each disappearing blip represented either an aircraft destroyed or one diving below the radar's coverage, and the ratio heavily favored the Americans. The Japanese formation, which had approached with military precision just 15 minutes earlier, now existed only as scattered survivors fleeing in all directions. Eggert's coordinated defense had achieved exactly what the doctrine promised: overwhelming numerical advantage at the point of contact. Even though the Japanese had committed nearly 50 aircraft to the attack, the science of fighter direction relied on principles that industrial efficiency experts would have recognized immediately. By centralizing information through radar and concentrating decision-making authority in a single controller, the system eliminated the confusion and duplication of effort that plagued decentralized operations. Each Hellcat pilot could focus entirely on flying and fighting, trusting that Eggert would warn them of threats they couldn't see and vector them toward targets they hadn't detected. This cognitive division of labor multiplied the effectiveness of each fighter exponentially. Hellcat leader, you have 5 bandits reforming at Angels 15, bearing 090. Distance 12 miles, Eggert transmitted to McCampbell, who had just shot down his second Japanese aircraft of the engagement. The kills brought his total to 21 confirmed victories, though he wouldn't know that until debriefing hours later. In the moment, McCampbell simply acknowledged the information and turned his division toward the indicated bearing, climbing to regain altitude advantage. The other Hellcat groups continued prosecuting the scattered Japanese aircraft, with Eggert assigning targets to ensure no enemy bomber reached attack range of the American carriers. The Japanese pilots faced an impossible tactical situation. Their radios, inferior to American equipment and often poorly maintained, crackled with confused, overlapping transmissions as squadron leaders tried to reorganize their shattered formations. Without radar, they had no way to detect approaching threats until visual contact, typically at ranges of 2 to 3 miles, by which time an attacking fighter was only seconds from gun range. The few Zero pilots who managed to shoot down Hellcats did so through exceptional skill or luck, briefly achieving the local numerical advantage necessary to overwhelm the American aircraft's superior capabilities. Lieutenant Matsuo Hajiri, a Japanese pilot with 8 months of flight training and 40 hours in the Zero fighter, experienced the battle as a sequence of terror and confusion. He had lost sight of his wingmen within the first 30 seconds of combat and now flew alone, scanning desperately for enemies while trying to stay near enough to the bombers to provide protection. A Hellcat appeared suddenly above and behind him, diving at tremendous speed. Hajiri yanked his stick back and right, throwing the Zero into a maximum performance turn that would have torn the wings off a Hellcat. But the American pilot didn't try to follow. Instead, he zoomed back to altitude, knowing that other Hellcats would keep Hajiri defensive while he maintained the energy advantage. According to historian John B. Lundstrom's detailed study of the first team and the Guadalcanal campaign, this patient, energy-fighting tactics represented a dramatic evolution from early war American fighter doctrine, which had often attempted to match Japanese aircraft in turning combat exactly what the Zero's design optimized for. By late 1944, American pilots fought to their aircraft's strengths, superior speed, diving ability, and the capacity to absorb battle damage. The doctrine explicitly warned against sustained turning combat with Japanese fighters, instead emphasizing high-speed slashing attacks coordinated to maintain numerical advantage. Eggert's radar scope showed the Japanese formation completely disintegrated now, with individual aircraft fleeing in all directions. All Hellcat flights, reform on your division leaders. "Do not pursue single bandits beyond 20 miles from base," he transmitted, enforcing the disciplined tactics that distinguished late-war American operations. Early in the conflict, American pilots had often pursued fleeing enemies until fuel starvation or mechanical problems left them vulnerable. By late 1944, doctrine emphasized formation integrity and fuel conservation over individual kill counts. The radio frequency that had crackled with combat communications gradually quieted as Hellcat pilots acknowledged Eggert's recall order and turned back toward the task force. The sky, so recently filled with maneuvering aircraft and tracer fire, now held only scattered debris oil slicks on the water's surface, floating wreckage, and occasionally the tiny figure of a parachute descending toward the sea. The mathematics had been brutal. Of the 46 Japanese aircraft that had approached the American carriers, only 11 would return to their bases. The American losses totaled for Hellcats, with 3 pilots recovered by search and rescue submarines positioned along likely egress routes. Lieutenant Masuo Hajiri survived the engagement through a combination of defensive flying and the simple good fortune of not being selected as a priority target. His Zero fighter, damaged by a glancing burst of machine gun fire that punctured his wing and severed several control cables, handled sluggishly as he turned west toward the Japanese-held Philippines. His radio, already marginal before combat, now transmitted nothing but static. He flew alone through empty sky, conserving fuel by reducing throttle to minimum sustainable power, calculating whether he had enough gasoline remaining to reach land. The journey would take 90 minutes. If the winds remained favorable, 90 minutes to reflect on a battle he'd barely survived. The action reports filed in the Lexington's Combat Information Center told the story in compressed, clinical language. Lieutenant Commander Eggert's log noted the initial radar contact at 0-7-20-3 hours, the launch of the fighter intercept at 0-7-20-6, and the first engagement at 0-7-30-9. It recorded vectors transmitted, warnings issued, and the steady reduction in hostile contacts as Japanese aircraft were destroyed or fled the area. The document, preserved in declassified files at the National Archives and Records Administration, contains no dramatic language, just times, bearings, distances, and results. Yet this bureaucratic prose documented a revolution in warfare, as significant as the introduction of the aircraft carrier itself. David McCampbell landed his Hellcat on the Lexington's deck at 0-9-15 hours, his aircraft showing bullet holes from a close encounter with a Japanese fighter. He climbed from the cockpit exhausted, his flight suit soaked with perspiration despite the high-altitude cold. During debriefing, intelligence officers would credit him with 3 confirmed kills and 1 probable, bringing his total to 24 confirmed victories. By the war's end, he would beat the U.S. Navy's top-scoring ace with 34 kills. But what impressed him most about this particular engagement wasn't his personal score. It was the systematic efficiency with which Eggert's fighter direction had coordinated 50 aircraft to achieve overwhelming tactical success. It was like having a guardian angel who could see everything. McCampbell later told a correspondent from the Saturday Evening Post, in an interview published in March 1945, "Joe Eggert could tell you where every Jap plane was before you could see them yourself. Made all the difference between finding the enemy and just flying around burning gas." This personal testimony captured the essence of the system's advantage. Enhanced situational awareness transformed individual aircraft into components of a larger, more capable weapon system. The Japanese pilots who survived faced a different kind of debriefing. Lieutenant Hajiri, who managed to coax his damaged Zero to a rough landing at a forward airstrip in light, reported being attacked simultaneously from multiple directions by aircraft that appeared to know exactly where the Japanese formation would be. His squadron commander, a veteran of China and the early Pacific campaigns, nodded grimly. American radar and fighter direction had become the subject of increasingly urgent reports to higher headquarters, but Japan's industrial and technological base couldn't produce equivalent systems in meaningful quantities. The empire was losing not just in numbers of aircraft and pilots, but in the fundamental capability to coordinate forces effectively. That evening, as the task force steamed through tropical darkness, Lieutenant Commander Eggert filed his detailed after-action report, and then allowed himself a moment of reflection. The green glow of the radar scope cast eerie shadows in the darkened Combat Information Center. Somewhere to the west, Japanese commanders were calculating losses and preparing new attacks. The war would continue for another 9 months, claiming hundreds of thousands more lives. But the battle fought on November 24, 1944, had demonstrated beyond question that radar-directed fighter defense had fundamentally changed aerial warfare. The Combat Information Center aboard the USS Lexington represented the culmination of 3 years of intensive development by American industry and military planners. The SCADA radar that Lieutenant Commander Eggert relied upon had been manufactured by General Electric, incorporating vacuum tubes, waveguides, and precision components that required thousands of hours of skilled labor to produce. According to technical documents preserved at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, the system could detect large aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 120 miles, giving carrier task forces roughly 30 minutes of warning before enemy aircraft came within attack range time that proved decisive in organizing defensive responses. The radar itself was only one component of a larger system. The plot room, adjacent to the Combat Information Center, employed teams of sailors who maintained a running tactical picture by marking aircraft positions on transparent plotting boards. Color-coded markers distinguished friendly forces from hostile contacts, with updated positions called out every 30 seconds as radar operators swept their scopes. This information display technique, borrowed from British air defense experience during the Battle of Britain, allowed commanders to visualize the tactical situation at a glance rather than trying to synthesize data from verbal reports alone. Fighter direction doctrine had evolved through painful trial and error. Early in the war, carrier task forces had stationed their combat air patrols in rigid defensive circles around the fleet, a tactic that Japanese formations often simply flew around before attacking from unexpected directions. By 1944, doctrine emphasized flexible positioning based on real-time radar information. Fighters orbited at various altitudes and positions relative to the carriers, ready to be vectored immediately toward detected threats. This reactive posture, guided by Eggert and operators like him, meant that attacking enemy aircraft almost always encountered defenders already positioned to intercept them. The Grumman F6F Hellcat that formed the primary instrument of this defensive system had been designed specifically to counter the lessons learned fighting the Japanese Zero. Where the Zero optimized for low-weight maneuverability, the Hellcat prioritized speed, climbing ability, and survivability. Its 18-cylinder Pratt and Whitney engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice that of the Zero's power plant, and its robust airframe could absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft in the hands of adequately trained pilots receiving quality tactical information from fighter directors. The Hellcat achieved a kill ratio exceeding 19-1 against Japanese aircraft in 1944. This technological and tactical superiority reflected broader patterns. In the Pacific War's later stages, American industry, operating with secure supply lines and abundant resources, produced weapons of increasing sophistication in overwhelming quantities. Japanese industry, strangled by submarine warfare that destroyed its merchant fleet and besieged by strategic bombing, struggled to maintain even basic production levels. A Japanese Navy fighter pilot in late 1944 flew an aircraft that might be several years old, maintained with salvaged parts, fueled with increasingly low-grade gasoline that reduced engine reliability. His American opponent flew a nearly new aircraft maintained by specialized technicians, with abundant spare parts and high-octane fuel that allowed full performance. The human dimension mattered equally. American naval aviation maintained a training pipeline that produced pilots with over 300 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. Japanese training, compressed by desperate necessity and fuel shortages, sometimes sent pilots into combat with fewer than 100 hours of total flying experience. This disparity showed clearly in combat effectiveness. Veteran Japanese pilots who survived could still occasionally achieve success through superior skill and aggression, but the average Japanese pilot in late 1944 was simply outclassed by his American counterpart. Lieutenant Commander Eggert, monitoring his radar scope during the quiet hours after the battle, understood these patterns intellectually but experienced them emotionally as well. Each blip that disappeared from his screen represented a human life, sometimes American, more often Japanese. The asymmetry of the losses troubled him during reflection, though during combat, his attention focused entirely on tactical execution. This psychological tension, the necessity of treating human beings as abstract game pieces, while simultaneously recognizing their humanity, was the burden carried by everyone involved. In the industrial-scale warfare that characterized 1944, the engagement off the Philippine coast on November 24, 1944, represented one small action in a conflict that encompassed the entire Pacific Ocean and involved millions of combatants. By late 1944, Japan's strategic position had become desperate. American forces had reconquered the Central Pacific through a series of island assaults that brought B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength, with most of its carriers sunk and its veteran air groups destroyed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought just 1 month before Lieutenant Commander Eggers' successful fighter direction, had demonstrated Japan's deteriorating situation with brutal clarity. In that sprawling engagement, tactically for separate battles fought over 3 days, the Japanese Navy committed nearly everything it had left in a desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion force at Leyte. The result was catastrophic. Japan lost for carriers 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, along with hundreds of aircraft and thousands of experienced sailors. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, Leyte Gulf effectively ended the Imperial Navy as a coherent fighting force, reducing it to isolated units capable only of sporadic, often suicidal attacks. The fighter direction tactics that Eggert employed so effectively had been developed partly in response to a terrifying new Japanese tactic introduced at Leyte Gulf, the organized suicide attack, or kamikaze. Japanese commanders, recognizing that conventional attacks had become nearly suicidal anyway given American defensive superiority, had decided to formalize suicide tactics. Pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships, trading their lives for the chance to inflict serious damage. These attacks proved disturbingly effective against ships caught without adequate fighter cover. A single kamikaze could cripple or sink a destroyer, damage a cruiser, or start catastrophic fires on a carrier's wooden flight deck. Radar-directed fighter defense provided the primary counter to kamikaze attacks. By detecting incoming raids at maximum range and vectoring fighters to intercept well away from the fleet, fighter directors like Eggert could destroy suicide aircraft before they reached their targets. The system wasn't perfect. Determined attackers flying low to avoid radar detection sometimes got through, but it dramatically reduced kamikaze effectiveness compared to the chaos that would have resulted without coordinated defense. The Philippines campaign, of which the November 24th engagement formed one small part, would continue through early 1945 and cost both sides terrible casualties. American forces would lose dozens of ships to kamikaze attacks despite improved defenses, while Japanese losses in aircraft and pilots would reach levels that made continued resistance mathematically impossible. Yet the fighting would continue for another 9 months, fueled by Japanese military culture that viewed surrender as unthinkable, and by American determination to achieve unconditional victory. Lieutenant Commander Eggert understood his role in this larger context. The 50 Hellcats he directed weren't just defending a few aircraft carriers, they were protecting the logistical and combat power that allowed American forces to project military force across thousands of miles of ocean. Every successful interception, every bomber shot down before reaching attack range, contributed to the steady grinding pressure that was slowly crushing Japan's capacity to resist. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses while inflicting unsustainable casualties on its opponent. That evening, as Eggert reviewed the day's action reports and prepared for the next day's operations, he reflected on the war's likely trajectory. The Philippines would be liberated by early 1945, bringing American forces within striking distance of Japan itself. The final assault on the home islands would be terrible. Millions of casualties were projected for both sides. Eggert hoped that Japan would surrender before invasion became necessary, but nothing in Japanese military culture or recent behavior suggested that outcome was likely. The war would continue, and he would continue directing his fighters against enemy formations, turning complex tactical problems into mathematical solutions on a glowing green radar scope. The sun rose over the Philippine Sea on November 25, 1944, illuminating a tactical situation unchanged from the previous day's sunset. The American Carrier Task Force maintained its station off the coast, launching and recovering aircraft in support of ground operations ashore, while remaining constantly alert for the next Japanese air attack. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Eggert reported to the Combat Information Center for another watch, settling into the familiar chair before his radar scope and beginning the process of tracking friendly aircraft and scanning for hostile contacts. The previous day's successful defense had been professionally satisfying, but the war continued, demanding the same vigilance and skill as every other day. The broader implications of radar-directed fighter defense would become clear only with historical perspective. The system pioneered in the Pacific War would evolve into modern air defense networks, that protect nations and military forces worldwide. The basic principle: centralized information gathering, coordinated response, and specialized division of cognitive labor would be applied to increasingly sophisticated sensors and weapons. The green glowing radar scope that Eggert monitored would evolve into computer-generated displays, showing tactical pictures synthesized from multiple sensors. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged: one operator coordinating multiple platforms to achieve effects that would be impossible through decentralized action. The human cost of the November 24 engagement had been relatively light by Pacific War standards: 3 American pilots killed or missing, compared to perhaps 90 Japanese aircrew lost with their aircraft. Yet each death represented an individual tragedy: families who would receive devastating telegrams, futures erased, potential unfulfilled. The Japanese pilots who died in the engagement had been someone's sons, possibly husbands or fathers, men with hopes and dreams and lives that mattered to someone. War's arithmetic reduced them to numbers and action reports, but the human reality transcended statistical abstractions. Lieutenant Matsuo Hajiri, the Japanese Zero pilot who survived through a combination of skill and fortune, would fly 7 more combat missions before the war's end. He survived to see Japan surrender on August 15, 1945, and spent the post-war decades working as a commercial airline pilot. In his memoirs, published in Japan in 1978, he described November 24, 1944, as the day he realized Japan had already lost the war. The systematic efficiency with which American fighters destroyed his squadron, guided by invisible technology to appear exactly where they would be most effective, convinced him that Japanese forces were fighting against an enemy whose industrial and technological superiority made victory impossible. David McCampbell, the American fighter ace who led the Hellcat intercept that morning, survived the war as the U.S. Navy's highest-scoring ace with 34 confirmed victories. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions in a different engagement and retired from the Navy as a captain in 1964. Throughout his post-war career, he emphasized the importance of the fighter direction system to his success, crediting operators like Eggert with providing the tactical information that made his victories possible. Individual skill mattered, McCampbell insisted, but coordinated teamwork mattered more. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Eggert himself continued directing fighters through the remainder of the Philippines campaign and the later assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He left the Navy after the war and worked in the emerging aerospace industry, applying his expertise in radar and coordination to the development of civilian air traffic control systems. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, deflecting attempts to credit him as a hero by insisting he had simply done his job. In 1993, 2 years before his death, he gave an oral history interview for the U.S. Naval Institute, describing the radar-directed fighter defense system in technical detail and expressing quiet pride in having contributed to an innovation that saved countless American lives. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the broader campaign that provided context for the November 24th engagement, would be remembered as one of the decisive campaigns of World War II. American forces would liberate the Philippines by early 1945, cutting Japan's access to the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and setting the stage for the final assault on the home islands. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, combined with Soviet entry into the war, would finally convince Japanese leaders to accept surrender, sparing both nations the catastrophic casualties of an invasion. The technological and tactical innovations pioneered during the war: radar, fighter direction, coordinated defense systems would shape military operations for generations. The Cold War air defense networks that protected both superpowers from nuclear bomber attack employed principles directly descended from the systems that Eggert operated in 1944. Modern integrated air defense systems, coordinating surface-to-air missiles, fighter aircraft, and multiple sensor types, represent the direct evolutionary descendants of the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Lexington. The human operator, sitting before an electronic display and making rapid decisions based on incomplete information, remains central to these systems despite dramatic advances in automation and artificial intelligence. As morning patrols launched from the Lexington on November 25, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Eggert watched his radar scope and prepared for whatever the day might bring. He couldn't know then that he had participated in demonstrating a revolution in warfare, or that historians would study his actions decades later. as exemplifying the transformation of naval aviation during World War II. He knew only that enemy aircraft might appear on his scope at any moment, requiring immediate, accurate response to protect the ships and men under his charge. The green glow of the radar continued its endless sweep, searching the sky for threats, transforming the invisible into the tactical, making the abstract concrete. In that darkened room, through that glowing screen, the future of aerial warfare had already arrived, precise, coordinated, and devastatingly effective.